So interesting, I guess topic maybe for today. Um, Something that happened. So I had a small group meeting at my church this last Sunday after church. You know, they had a meal and everything. They were talking about some of the challenges that the small group leaders had faced, and one of which was guy brought that there was a guy who had started coming to his small group. I don't think he mentioned that like not a member of our church, just happened to start coming, and that he's a young guy, but he's married and has a family, and yet just not getting it together on the job front. And he's talking like that he's gotten jobs, but he hasn't held them because he'll make up excuses as to why. And which I responded that so he actually mentioned like, so if anybody has any contact information for some jobs that he might be able to pursue, let him know. And I said he doesn't need a job, he needs a work ethic. To which later he's like, yeah, the guy like affirmed that, but made me start to wonder, start to think about where does that come from? Work ethic, because I'd say that it's intrinsic to what it means to be a man, to have a good, mature work ethic, the just kind of stick to itiveness of that. Doesn't matter what your job is, if you've got bills, you go to that job and you pay those bills and you take care of your responsibilities. Uh, like, where did that come from? And as I was going back through it, uh, at least from most of the conversations I have had and that I could reflect on, it's been that I got it from my dad. And that most of the guys that I knew, that they got that from watching their dad go to work, doing stuff like, I mean, crap jobs like selling Kirby vacuum cleaners or working in the fields or doing things like that, where it's just tough, especially some of these older generations where a lot of the labor that was being done was uh, industrial line work, a lot of industrial farm work, a lot of things like that where it was hard, back-breaking type of work. But uh, so that's kind of what I was, that most men that I know that I would look at and say like they have that, they've gotten that to that place of actual maturity, regardless of their age. Is like they saw their dads working and then followed in that example. A lot of them even going into that same field or that same realm of study. And I can't rationalize, I guess, any explanation that would divide those two things, which led me to this conclusion. As far as, because I had a comment on one of my other videos today, actually, that I received, that the person's like challenging the idea of maturity, the expectation that men need to be mature, of that, with the question, kind of rhetorical question of how do you define maturity, which then begged that question again, more of like, where does this come from? This idea of like maturity, of manhood, of work ethic, all these things. Where does it come from? And what I've come to the conclusion of is that it's not something that's learned or achieved, but it's something that's bestowed. That it's something that's passed down as a birthright, as an inheritance from one man to the next. And the reason you have these guys that they get to adulthood, or I guess you could say maybe like just sexual maturity is really where they're at, without ever reaching the place of that emotional, psychological maturity, with those intangible attributes that are integral to manhood, is that they've never had that bestowed onto them. And there's plenty of examples of that just in Scripture, because you have Eli in the Old Testament, book of 1 Samuel. He was the high priest. He had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they were evil, corrupt, terrible men that were sexually assaulting women in the temple and forcibly taking as like a tariff, essentially, the from the sacrifices before God. And Eli just refusing to do any. Everybody knew about it, but he refused to do anything about it. Then you have Samuel, who comes along, who he goes off and like finds David and anoints him as king, and then just kind of abandons him. Really doesn't do anything. That most of the story of Samuel is kind of summed up by this conflict that was constantly coming up between him and Saul. Of that Saul was the king and doing all kinds of stupid things, and Samuel just kind of letting it happen. The reason they asked for a king to begin with is that even though Samuel was righteous, his sons were evil. And that's kind of the sum of that. Every time you see a broken man like that, his family heritage is just as broken. You have that as well from Abraham to Isaac and Isaac to Jacob, and just over and over and over, and showing favoritism and unhealthy rejection even of their children. But there are certain instances when you see this as, I guess, done righteously. And what's interesting is it's almost exclusively done outside of the family context. Half of the New Testament itself was only given to us because of the fact that you have a man either writing on behalf of or writing to a mentorship relationship he had with a younger man. That's 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, first off, but then also every single church that Paul himself planted as well. And then you have John, who is like, I guess you could say, the father of, or kind of in a fathership role over the Ephesian church, which brought us 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and the part of the book of Revelation. And then you have the book of 1st and 2nd Peter as well, that mentored by Jesus himself, right? You have these, when you have these solid mentor relationships between a strong spiritual man and honestly some of the most ridiculously broken men ever. I mean, you have Paul, who was originally a persecutor of the church and a murderer, and then you have Peter, who denied Christ famously 3 different times, right? And yet, despite those failures, they just kept, that mentor just kept coming after them and bringing them in deeper. You have as well the examples of Priscilla and Aquila, who helped train and mentor Apollos despite his gifts that was partially ignorant. They ended up bringing him up to full knowledge and understanding of the truth of Scripture. Like, there's no Christianity, as far as we know. There's no biblical record, even, if it's not for that mentor relationship. And even in the Old Testament, you have David, greatest king in all of Israel's history, wrote the book of Psalms, as well as at the end of his life, he actually calls his son in, Solomon, who is the heir to the throne, and tells him, keep your heart true to Christ. Like, give your life over to him and follow the statutes of God's law. Like, purposefully transferring that authority onto him and transferring that need, like, to his son. And I think that's the thing that's missing. What is manhood? What does it mean to be mature? Is to be given maturity. And that's where, I mean, fatherlessness throughout our society is just rampant. People are not taught from the youngest age that men are expected to do certain things, and they're expected to not do certain things. And society has obviously suffered as a result. So I guess that's what I would say of that. That's the main issue that has occurred. So if you are a man out there that's like, man, I just wish I had somebody out there, or I wish that I had some of these things I see other generations of having, of that work ethic and that desire to provide for I wish I had those things, but I just don't. What you need is to find a man and just watch what he's doing and ask intentional questions. Write down their answers. Like, that's what you need to do. If that's uncomfortable, you don't. If that's embarrassing, get over it. Get over it. That's really all I can say to you about it. Is just get over it, because there is no growing up. There is no maturity without that relationship with the older man and the younger man. In fact, 1 John even dedicates a significant portion of the book to older and younger men. Like fathers, children, young men, and fathers. Children, young men, and fathers. All the way through. I've written these things so that you, children, young men, fathers, that these certain things will happen. So that's what I guess what I'm getting at. If you don't have that in your life, pursue it. In your local church, start looking for the guys around you where their wives love them and don't have anything negative to say about them. Not to say like that they're dishonest or that they don't that they don't know that they defecate like all the rest of us, but simply that they are what Scripture says is a well-watered vine. Find that woman, you'll find a man next to her that has whatever this is in kind of more developed, I guess you could say. You also find children that aren't just insane, because that's the expectation of the elders in the church, that aren't going around sleeping around, sneaking out, doing all those things. They have a dad that's got this on lock as well, as much as a human can. So that's what I say. Get involved with the small group as well and just see what happens. Worst case scenario, you need to find another small group. But that's what I say. That's what I'm getting at, I guess. Get involved with one of those kind of relationships. If you have any questions about that, or you want to challenge me on it, whatever you want to do, leave a comment, like, subscribe, whatever. And I don't know. We'll see you next week.